Today I want to talk to you about the metropolis of Holtburg, also referred to simply as the metropolis. While many of the major cities are quite large, I like to use real life as an example here. I mean, how often in fiction is a city the size of what's basically your neighborhood in real life? Like I used to live in, I used to live in California a long time ago, and even if you're living in like I'll use Carlsbad as an example. Most of you probably don't know what that is, but Carlsbad is probably about the size of Midgar in the way it's overall portrayed. Because in fiction, especially in video games, cities are usually portrayed as tiny. That's always bothered me just a little bit. I get it. I do understand it. I get the fact that you have to interpret it. FF6 is a great example of the fact that we're supposed to interpret that South Figaro is actually this sprawling harbor town, and yet in the game it's, what, like 3 screens or whatever? That's a slight exaggeration, but it's not that big. But so when I'm doing a setting which is not limited by video game and art design and the requirements of rendering an entire city, I usually make my cities the size of cities. So most of these major cities are about the size of a city. We're talking like 20-ish miles across, give or take. Actually, that's a little bit down, isn't it? Like 20 to 30-ish miles across, something like that. But Holtburg dwarfs them all. Holtburg is actually 70 miles in diameter from wall to wall. The great walls that have been built around it have been expanding steadily for a fairly long period of time, and most especially recently in the wake of the massive influx of refugees, of Stoneholders, the Stoneholder refugees, I should say. The metropolis of Holtburg is, therefore, if I'm not getting my point across, gigantic. It's also one of the only cities in the entire world that actually has what are effectively taxis. They're very, very small airships. I say airship, but they're actually referred to as skiffs in lore, and they're kind of like hovercraft in, say, Star Wars, for example. Same basic concept as the airship, but very small scale, very cheap, very easy to break. But much more useful because of the speeds they can get to, which is not inconsiderable. And there's quite a few of those that are in use throughout the Holtburg area because it's one of the only ways to get around proper. The whole of Holtburg is so large it is in many ways considered a nation unto itself. One of the reasons that the seat of power for the Eluvian kingdom was founded in Holtburg is because of this massive size. Yes, even about 100 years ago, when the kingdom of Illumia was founded, Holtburg was still gargantuan. Nowadays, it is even larger than that, as I gave you the actual diameter earlier. It is a huge, varied metropolis of so many different people and cultures and races. Olthoi are a regular feature, and you could find like a cafe where the food literally will slide up through the table, freshly cooked and translated there through the custom woven table. You can find tailors who will actually have custom woven craft that will actually start taking your measurements and whatnot while they're off selecting fabric and that sort of a thing. If you want, Lugian food, if you want ogre food, if you want Banderling food, if you want Olthoi food, if you want elf food. I was going to say human food. What I meant to say was actually normal food, but in this case that would be elven food, dwarven food. It's all available. There are a large number of skyscrapers that have been built up over time. These are not structurally sound. They require a constant influx of elemental energy, specifically from the element of fire, is the ley line that Holtburg sits over. It's not directly over it, but the elemental temple of fire is not particularly far away, so it's pretty close to the nexus of that ley line. And that energy is used to constantly keep those structures sound. If it was to go off for any reason, that would probably lead to some bad things, as you've seen in basically every disaster movie ever made. And these skyscrapers are not for one facility. Usually the major corporations will rent or own a number of floors on these skyscrapers, and they'll, these 10 floors exist for the PTC, and these 10 floors exist for XDY, and so forth and so on. Those are actual companies, the Provincial Trading Company and Zelios Drive Yards, respectively. There's the massive Holtburg Harbor, which is the largest harbor in the world. That's actually true, as opposed to just in the continent. It is a stupidly huge harbor. It dwarfs any harbor in real life, actually. Now, it is also one of the most unsafe harbors in the world because it's absolutely colossally huge, and even with magic assisting, it's pretty hard to coordinate that large of a port, and it's it requires a literal constant effort to try and keep the waters to not be completely disgustingly polluted, so that the people within several miles of trade winds are not actually going to have to smell the harbor, which is funny because that ties into the sewer system they have. This is actually a fairly new feature. The mites, the gnomes, and the Lugians, the Republic, invented this concept, but the Alluvians are the one who implemented it, since they don't actually have a lot of use for this back in the Republic. So it's basically the same as your everyday sewer system, except for the fact that everything that's tossed in is mulched and pulped by energy, which is pushed through the sewer lines, and that sluices them down into base, like this kind of base slurry, which also happens to completely sterilize it at the process, because all the bacteria and all the microorganisms are actually killed in the process. So you just have base matter, which actually doesn't really have a smell or a taste or any other consistency. And then that is then pumped into an area where it is shipped off or dumped off, depending on the perspective. Usually it's just dumped off into the ocean. But there are certain places that try to recycle that into something usable, but most of that hasn't really gone anywhere because they don't have that level of technology or magic to fully recycle atoms at that level. They're lucky enough to be able to destroy down to the level that they can. Holtburg is divided into several districts. Each district is basically the size of most other cities by themselves. The Royal District, which is, of course, where most of the aristocracy lives. There are governmental headquarters there as well. The High Queen's Palace is there, and the Lord's Manor is usually within the Royal District. But the Royal District's primary purpose is to serve as a place for all the nobility to play their Game of Thrones. And I hate to name drop like that, but that is basically what they're doing. They're just playing with each other at this point. They're and wasting money and time and resources on an endless dick measuring contest amongst themselves. And the aristocracy spends a huge amount of time and money on their little games. And that's pretty much why the Royal District is separate from everywhere else. There's also the Commerce District, which is the largest district by far. Most of those skyscrapers I mentioned are there. There are huge markets that actually go up into the sky. So, most of the city streets within the Commerce District are effectively canyons because of the buildings built up around them. When I say skyscrapers, I hate to draw directly from something in fiction, but to give you an idea, I don't mean how we in real life see skyscrapers, big glass buildings. I want you to picture, if you've ever seen it, the main Imperial city in Guild Wars Factions. I can't think of the name of the city, I'm so sorry. But if you look up Guild Wars Factions, city, and there should be some artwork of that, and you could kind of see what I mean by that. There's just really crudely, roughly built city that's just built up and up and up until the point where each street is a canyon, like I said. And usually there's tiers. Small ladders, pulleys, ropes, crude elevators that are actually, you literally have to pull yourself up, that kind of thing. Because most of the merchants are not on the ground level. The ground level merchants are the ones who are well off. Now, to explain what I mean a little bit about this, you know how in real life, in New York or in Tokyo or anything like that, real estate is very, very expensive because of how little of it there is available? That's kind of the same thing here. Someone who has like a one-bedroom apartment, a flat in New York City, is probably going to be spending more on that than we spend on this entire house, for example, every month. That's not a joke. This is kind of the way it works. So the very wealthy off merchants are the ones who have stands down at the ground level. Either that, or they're very politically connected, or they literally have the muscle in order to prevent other people from taking it, whatever it happens to be. But you have to really be able to hold on to ground level merchandise. So even though someone has just like a stall, like literally just a wooden bench with a little thing saying, here, buy this stuff, that person is pretty well off either financially or politically or in terms of personal power. The most of the merchants are actually further up, usually built into the buildings, sometimes built onto the buildings, and those are the ones who have the ladders set up, or the pulley system, or the little elevators, or anything like that, to help you get up and try to hawk their merchandise. This also has the byproduct of the fact that the Commerce District is extremely noisy. There are magicite lamps everywhere, which is basically giant chunks of magicite crystal that just glow very, very brightly and bathe an area in light. And so in certain areas of the Commerce District, you can't tell if it's day or night. It's basically impossible. If you look straight up, there's going to be too much light pollution to see, and it's the same light whether it's day or night, so it basically doesn't matter. They actually have a few issues with weather in the area, though. The wind going through some of there is pretty bad, and so that's something you have to be aware of as well. And they have, in some of the more well-off districts, or streets, I should say, actually have custom woven veils, basically, which whose their only purpose is to prevent wind from coming into it. So like you can walk through it because it's not preventing you, but like the moment you walk through it, you might be pushed back into it because the wind is still coming. There's also the a few areas where they basically have custom altered gravity, for lack of a better term. In other words, temporary areas of bubbles where you can walk up onto the canyon walls of the buildings and therefore have more real estate to work with. That has just begun entering production, so to speak. So only a couple of the streets actually have that there, and only the richest and most powerful companies actually have those kind of things. It's also very, very loud in this area. Most people are constantly hawking their wares, constantly saying, hey, I've got this, or I'm looking for this, and whatnot. And it is a colossal, massive mess. If you're actually going there looking for something specific, the odds are quite good you will not find it. If you go there looking for nothing in specific, you might be broke by the time you leave. Crime is an unusual issue. Back when the undermarket was in its heyday, the undermarket basically paid off or killed anyone who tried to really do any major criminal activity in the commerce district. It was bad for business, in other words. It was in their best interest to keep commerce running smoothly and to encourage people to trade, which means cutting back on crime. In other words, the less crime there is, the more people will feel safe going there and trading. That has, since the undermarket died, that has gone down a bit. And I need to mention that to the exchange sometime soon. But regardless, crime has slowly started creeping back up recently. But since the exchange since the undermarket only died like a month ago in lore, the criminal element hasn't like surged back in because they're so accustomed to not even bothering. There's also I've already mentioned the harbor. There's the warehouse district, which, as you might imagine, is exactly what it sounds like. It is mile after mile of warehouses and cargo containers and all that. Unlike most of the other districts, this place is extremely organized. It's very well laid out. It's a full grid. And basically the streets are custom to the warehouse. So you have numbers. It's like number across and number down. They usually refer to it as 3A or 3C. Or excuse me, 3R or 3C. I'm saying it wrong. So 3 row or 3 column, in other words. And that goes by north-south, or north-south, east-west kind of a orientation. So if you have the address, at the corner of 3R, 3C, for example, you pretty much know exactly where to go, and you can find your way around there very quickly and very easily. That organization is absolutely mandatory given the colossal traffic it has. The city streets in the warehouse district are huge. We're talking like 7-lane across highway kind of a situation. Lots and lots and lots and lots of traffic. Again, at all days of the hours of the week, because all those restaurants in the city and all those merchants and all those people who live there and all the rural district, all of them need a more or less constant influx of everything. And, well, of course, there are also exports. Holtburg is a major exporter as well. So all of that is just this constant flow of everything. Crime is a little bit more of an issue here, mainly because nobody cares quite as much, and patrolling the massive warehouse district would actually be much more difficult than it sounds. It would be way too easy to get away with it. However, it's not a huge issue. There's never been like an organized crime who has actually managed to get a stranglehold on the warehouse district. There have been people who tried, and those people have died, because when you get to the level where you start organizing and you start affecting the trade of the city as the whole, usually the local lord notices, and they walk in with the military. Then there's the military district, the actual headquarters and central government, for lack of a better term, of the entire Alluvian military centered here. They have the largest airship construction yards in the entire continent is present in this district, and in fact takes up most of the district. To be completely honest, it's been converted into an airship construction yard. The Leviathan itself, the massive super dreadnought, was actually built there along with most of the frigates that Alluvia employs. There's some problems with that. Basically, they insisted on not buying their ships, but making their own. Anybody who knows anything about the realities of, say, logistics and cost of expense understands why that's such an issue. But They also have a huge, huge barracks area, most of the local prisons there. The Alluvian military is the police and fire department and social workers and all that fun stuff. So a lot of people are stationed there in order to service the entire city of Holtburg proper. There are also two residential districts. It basically boils down to the rich district and the poor district. Although that's, again, a bit of a misnomer. Even the poor in Holtburg are actually closer to what we would call, middle class, well-off people who actually have, a regular job and whatnot. They're not living in poverty. So they can eat, they can function. Most of those houses are fairly normal, actually, and fairly commonplace. If you look at, if you were to like Google image search, just neighborhood, normal old neighborhood. That's kind of what you got. They have terrain to work with. They have yards. They have lawns and trees and two-story houses. It's quite normal and mundane actually. And I don't actually have much else to share about it. The poor district is expanding at a fairly rapid rate. There have been talks about adding a new district, a actually poor district for the refugees, but that has not actually come to fruition yet, and they would need the major walls to expand anyways. The rich district, that's a little bit different. The rich district is where two groups of people live in. First of all those royals, all the aristocrats, they actually live here. But I'm saying that wrong. Why don't I talk about them second? Let's talk about the well-off leaders of. I shouldn't say leaders. I'm saying this wrong. It's where the middle managers live. Like all those major companies and corporations and the mercenary corps and the shipping companies, all those various places have tons and tons of people who actually run the businesses, right? This is where they live. They are comfortable, well off. They have, basically villas, three-story houses, large, many, many acres of land to work with, that kind of a thing. They're exceptionally well off, and they get regular shipments of food and goods and whatnot in order to be able to function. And local grocery markets, all that stuff, everything you would imagine from that. And they have basically miniature cities. They call them neighborhoods, but each of their neighborhood is pretty darn large, as you might imagine. And so each one basically is like a self-contained unit, and they kind of run their own affairs as sort of a committee. Each cell has its own committee of the people who live there who take care of it. But I stress that middle management thing because the actual rulers and the actual leaders of those companies are the aristocrats. Those guys live over in the royal district. And technically here. Now I say technically because they don't actually live here. This is not where they sleep at night. They don't journey the ridiculous commute between the residential district, which is way over in the northwest corner, and way over here to the royal district, which is in the far northeast corner. Every day. They actually live in the royal district. But they own those houses, some of those houses back there. And so their family members are the ones who stay there. Now, what happens there kind of varies. Some of those people are just, content to live their lives and live the life of luxury and just say, I have an infinite, credit card basically, so I'm just going to enjoy my life here. Some of those people, this goes for children, wives, husbands, friends, family, it doesn't matter. Whoever is allowed to live in the aristocrats' homes over here in the rich district. Some of them like to play a smaller version of the Game of Thrones thing. In their case, though, it is much, much smaller scale. In fact, it's funny because this is actually a real life thing too. The idea of having the nicer yard, having the latest tool, having the latest fashion, having those little parties that you hold, but you're only really holding those parties to show off how much better you are than the other people attending. That kind of a thing tends to happen fairly commonly, and so there's a lot of internal politicking there that doesn't really affect anyone that much, but means a lot of commerce goes through there regularly. And then there's the final group of people who are members of the aristocrats, and those people who live there are part of the undermarket. And it's basically one of the biggest places the undermarket has always based its business off. In fact, the Hidden Vale, which is the infrastructure that the undermarket has used for many, many, many years going throughout Holtburg, has a lot of its nexus points there. In fact, the actual exchange's primary office, for lack of a better term, is actually in that area. I think that's actually all I've got about Holtburg. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me ramble on about a city. But if you have any further questions, of course, please feel free to ask. And otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.